4 to 7 years. That's how long it takes thousands of people to make one animated film. And shorter films can still take a few hundred people a couple of years to make. So only an absolute idiot would try and make one in only 24 hours. I've never even attempted a project like this before, and in such a small time frame, I need to come up with an idea, design the characters, make the characters, rig them, animate them, render and composite all of this together, all in less than a day. There's so much to do in such little time, I'm not even sure it's entirely possible. But let's try it anyway. The first thing I need to do is to come up with a good story, which is easier said than done. I had a few ideas ranging from a lightsaber wielding droid, a stormtrooper chase sequence, and even a droid that's turned to the dark side. But all of these were way too complex, and in the end I kept it simple and drafted an outline of a lone droid losing some important plans that were stolen by a rival droid. This was simple enough. It only needed 2 characters, one small environment, and most important of all, it was simple to animate. This whole ideation process only took around 30 to 40 minutes, so with 23 hours and 20 minutes to go, I was feeling pretty confident. Drafting a basic outline of the story, I went on to concepting the main character. I took inspiration from the thousands of Star Wars concepts all over Pinterest and ArtStation, and I particularly like the style of Luke Fisher and Dimitri Burmak. I also stumbled upon this ArtStation page which showcases some amazing character and environment work by ILM artists. So feeling inspired, I started thumbnailing a few different sketches, keeping them very basic. After sketching some of these designs, I settled on a few that I wanted to take further. I liked the overall astromech aesthetic, and I loved the idea of a droid moving on a tire. I really wanted it to feel like it was all cobbled together from a bunch of separate parts. So with 3 basic ideas sketched out, I settled on combining elements from these 2 designs. These quick sketches took about an hour and a half to make, so I've got roughly 22 hours to go. Normally the next step would be storyboarding, but to try and save time, I'm actually going to try something else. Because I knew the basic shapes of the characters I wanted to make, I thought the best way would be to plan out the animation in 3D. So I quickly added a couple of primitives together to make up the main shapes of our characters. I also added a few more cubes to block out the basic environment. All I wanted to do at this stage was to figure out the basic timings and the locations of the characters before I committed to the main animation. Think of this more like a 3D animatic, consisting of rough timings and poses. I also tried to tie down the camera movement here too, just so I could get an idea of the framing. Here you can see the final result of the blockout, and you can see it serves its purpose. Basic animation with a hint of camera movement to see if the story is being carried across. This was by no means locked in terms of what the final animation would come to look like, but it did help me make the choices in terms of what worked well and what didn't work well. With pre-production over, I only had 21 hours to model, texture, rig, animate, light, render and composite all of this together. I think I might have bitten off more than I can chew. Moving straight onto character modelling, I started with the simplest, the mouse droid. I used basic shapes to block out the main forms and extrude panels where necessary. For the details, I subdivided a plane and extruded individual faces. I'm using a bevel modifier on pretty much all solid surfaces just to get rid of that perfect CG edge. And after adding in just a couple more details, the mouse droid was done. Time to move on to our main character. This one was slightly harder, but it started off basically the same. I used a mix of booleans and the knife tool to get the shapes I needed to match the concept. From there, it was just a case of adding paneling and some extrusions for the details. Now normally texturing would definitely take me quite a while, but luckily I did have these pre-made texture nodes that I made a few weeks ago that I'll be using in this project, and I'll be hooking them up to create a base painted metal shader. Once I had a base, it was then just a case of duplicating the setup and changing the colour for the different panels on the body to add a little bit more visual interest. I did the same process for the mouse droid but adjusted the colours to match. I could have definitely spent more time on this, but the hours were quickly running out and I still needed to make the environment. Thankfully I had the blockout to work from, so using the same techniques of quickly slicing, separating and beveling the meshes, I made a few panels for the walls and floor as well as this Star Wars looking door. The corridor wasn't based on anything in particular, but I wanted it to look like an Imperial base of some sort, so adding in some Death Star style panel lighting is a must. I used the same material processes in the environment as I did for the characters. It wasn't perfect, but it will have to do. With everything made up, I quickly modelled the one prop we have, which luckily was made up from some pretty simple shapes. This whole process took about 2.5 hours, but with just over half of my time left, I still needed to rig and animate these characters as well as render this whole thing out. By blocking the animation out beforehand, I knew exactly what parts of the models needed to move and what didn't. This pretty much streamlined the rigging process, as it meant I could really focus on what control I needed for each character. I knew both droids would be making some pretty tight turns, so adding in some banking control was a must. I also wanted to add in some squash and stretch to really exaggerate both of these characters. And the last thing I added was to add some automatic reel rotation when you move the character forward and back. Now this should make animating these characters a lot easier. All I needed to do now was to add these rigs back into my scene and start animating. But with so much left to do and only half my time left to do it in, panic started to set in. Luckily though, I had my block out, which I used to go through and plan the rough timings using the new rigs. So I worked through, starting with our main character, until I had a better idea of the movement. With that done, I can compare it back to our original block out, and you can see how much the original has really helped define our entire short film. All that was left to do now was do the exact same for the second character. With the animation basically done, I now only have 4 hours to light, render and add some audio and composite it all together. So for the lights, I added a couple of area lights as well as a HDRI to brighten the shadows up a bit. I also animated a couple of blaster bolts hitting the wall, and these were just cylinders with an emission shader. I then added some quick lightning effects using a Geometry Nodes preset. Messing around with these last little details took about an hour, so I really needed to call it a day. For speed, I'm rendering with Eevee, Blender's real-time renderer, but even though these speeds were quicker, I still needed to render nearly 800 frames, and I had no idea how long that was going to take. I just had to cross my fingers and hope for the best.
A few moments later.
With just under 2 hours left of my original 24-hour time limit, I raced to find some free sound effects online and started compositing it all together, adding some quick color grading and music until finally my time was up. Is it perfect? Absolutely not. But for a day's work, I don't think it looked too bad. After the 24 hours was up, I did go back in and make some small changes, polish it up a little bit and render it out at 4K. And you can watch the more polished version right here. And if you want to learn more about animating in Blender, be sure to subscribe to make sure you never miss out on an amazing tutorial.